Nice. I think Jeremy and I are going to drink a bunch of kava and then have second dinner. Welcome to I'd Buy That for $1, a podcast about inexpensive, common, and underappreciated records that are waiting to be rediscovered. I'm your co-host, Sean Hartman, in-house graphic designer for Mother Croker's Hemorrhoid Ointment.
I'm co-host Jeremy Ruggles, covert reorganizer of DJ Hard Bargain's Discog Store Jazz section.
Oof, that's a lot of work.
Yeah, don't tell him I'm not reorganizing it for the better. Let's say that.
I am co-host Peter, the crooning troubadour.
And I am guest Chris Connolly, and I ran away from Scotland, and I can't tell you what I do now.
Oh my, you're on the lam.
Well, thanks for joining us, Chris. Do you want to tell the people about yourself real quick before we dive into today's record?
Yes, like I said, I ran away from Scotland. I reside in the United States. I'm a musician. I've been playing music for over 40 years now, since the late 70s. And I moved over here in the mid to late 80s to join the band Ministry. And I collaborate with very many people, and I have collaborated with many people, and it's what I do and it's what I like.
Right on.
Yeah, you have an extensive discography. Looking at your solo work alone, but then, Pigface and Revolting Cocks and all kinds of stuff.
Yeah, and much of it is in the bargain bin, so you could buy that for $1.
Well, you selected the record for this week. Do you want to tell us what we're going to be listening to?
We're going to be listening to Tiny Tim's second album, which is called Tiny Tim's Second Album. And
appropriately titled.
It's from 1968, and that's what we're going to be looking at this week.
Cool. Well, let's go ahead and jump into your first track selection. My Dreams Are Getting Better All the Time, Side A, Track 2.
Smiled at me in my dreams last night. My dreams are getting better all the time. And what do you know, you looked at me in a different light. My dreams are getting better all the time. To think that we were strangers a couple of nights ago, and though it's a dream, I never dreamed you'd ever say hello. Well, maybe tonight you hold me tight when the moonbeams shine. My dreams are getting better all the time. My dreams are getting better all the time. My dreams are getting better all the time. To think that we were strangers a couple of nights ago, and though it's a dream, I never dreamed you'd ever say hello. Well, maybe tonight you'll hold me tight when the moonbeams shine. My dreams are getting better all the time. Oh, wow, wow. My dreams are getting better all the time.
That's exactly the kind of thing that I started diving deeper into music to find.
That's the pinnacle of record collecting for you?
Well, it's just... there's so much going on there, but it's so well done, and it's just bizarre, but joyous and at the same time.
Yeah, I think that one of the things I've noticed about Tiny Tim's first two records is they're both produced by Richard Perry, who's quite a named producer. I mean, we've all heard of Richard Perry. I mean, he remained contemporary for a long time. But he seems to really love this. I mean, the attention to detail and the production. the production of doing a record like that in those days, you know, you had to find the right players and you had to find the right orchestra and the right studio, and you were working with probably a very temperamental and fragile ego in the form of Tiny Tim. So what a beautiful job was done.
Yeah. Very specific aesthetic to bring that many people together and achieve.
Not unlike someone like Brian Wilson, who brought together a similar ensemble. But, you know, looking at it from 2021, can you even imagine a record company throwing that kind of money at that? Wow. I mean, wow. What a dream.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, and a record company owned by Frank Sinatra, no less.
Of course, yeah. Yeah.
One of the things that has continually kept me drawn to Tiny Tim's music is the way that he presents these silly songs in earnest. You know, he's not afraid to make humorous and serious songs, but he kind of gives it the same energy either way, almost. And I think that in some ways speaks to a lot of his longevity and fame.
I agree. And one of the things that I noticed about Tiny Tim from the moment I heard him, when he slips into falsetto, when he does that, he means it. There's nothing self-conscious about it at all. And, you know, the first time I heard him, it was Tiptoe Through the Tulips. But then I heard songs where and many of the songs on this album are two characters, you know, the deeper voice and it's very unself-conscious and actually probably really well rehearsed. Some of the things he's doing is, you know, basically slipping in and out of characters, either male and female or two different males or whatever. But there's nothing, he meant it, you know, to me.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this wasn't just a simple joke or novelty to him. And it's kind of a miracle that, like you're saying, these producers that he got hooked up with were able to recognize that element in his music and treat the arrangements with that level of seriousness and commitment.
Yeah, and you know, with all respect to Tiny Tim, if you think about who was making records at that time and who you're going to be thrown in, if you're a staff producer, if you were thrown in with someone like, I'm just pulling names out the air, like the Jefferson Airplane or something like that, who might show up like high on acid or something, you know that Tiny Tim was a professional. No matter how eccentric he may seem, he knew his music very, very well. And there were so many new bands who were just a sort of Haighton-Ashbury mess. To try and corral a band in the studio was probably a nightmare most of the time. But this is more showbiz, baby, you know.
Yeah.
But so wrong in that respect, but still, yeah, so right.
Mm-hmm. So if you were to try and sell someone on Tiny Tim who's either not familiar or maybe just has heard Tiptoe Through the Tulips and thinks of him as a novelty act to be passed off, what would your argument be? What would you do to convince?
Oh, well, it would be easy for me. I've compelled people to buy things before because I'm such a record nut. But look, I have told people about Tiny Tim's second album and they're all like, really? And it's the same as I say when I say, Love Over Gold by Dire Straits is a brilliant album. Really? Well, look at the work that went into it. Look at how beautifully paced it is. Look at how the depths of the songs. And this also, for me, when I first heard this album at 14 years old in Edinburgh, in Scotland, it brought to me this wonderful sense of memory, this sense of memory of a place I'd never been. And that place was kind of New York in the 50s. Like kids playing in the streets, and it was very romantic. I mean, it was so romantic, and it's all over this album and the storytelling. Very, very American, and I think I'd have a really easy time to get someone to listen to it. I mean, I remember telling someone, okay, it's slightly different topic. I told someone to buy the second Scott Walker album, and she got back to me and said it was just like having a panic attack for 40 minutes. So I was wrong. And I could see someone coming back to me with Tiny Tim and just being really disturbed by it. But I think you have to listen to it. I mean, you have to really listen to it at a deep level.
Yeah, as someone who had just heard of Tiny Tim about a week ago, I was unfamiliar, and like at first blush, I was like, what is this? Why is he doing this put on? But the more you listen and the more you read about him, like it was not a put on at all.
No,
He was extremely knowledgeable about turn of the century pop music. He's an extremely talented musician, and he believes the things I don't know, it's all earnest. It's not how you might perceive it at first.
Yeah. And I mean, I think that all goes into this record, into Tiny Tim's second album, which, you know, did not do so well. And I'm shocked that it didn't, but in a sense, I'm not, because it was 1968. I mean, it was to get young sort of people who were going to Woodstock to buy this seems like a hard sell. It seems like a hard thing to do after the one novelty hit of the year before.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I feel like, you know, there had to be a certain amount of like the Woodstock crowd that got it as like this kind of, you know, genuine outsider, weirdo, people's champion kind of thing. But most of the people just casually hearing Tiptoe Through the Tulips are not going to make that association right away.
Of course. Yeah.
Yeah, I guess this would have been their parents or even their grandparents' generation music that Tiny Tim is calling back. And so, you know, that might not necessarily, you know, at the height of the kind of the rebellion and the generation gap to, oh yeah, remember the good old days of this kind of pop music?
Right. Mm-hmm. Right. People didn't want that kind of thing then. And in fact, it's funny because one of my biggest pet peeves about being a record collector is there's a certain time between sort of 1969 and 1972 where most everyone on their records had to have one ragtimey song. Yeah. And it was almost like they were poking fun at that genre. It's like, here you go, old timer.
Yeah, thinking they had like a Country Joe and the Fish at Woodstock did. I feel like I'm fixing to die rag.
Yeah. But historically, and I know we're going to get into the history of Tiny Tim later, it is revealed as not any kind of novelty at all. I mean, this is what the man did. And to have his, that kind of dream brought to life for him must have been incredible. To do Tiny Tim's second album, to go in with Richard Perry with this vision of something, because it is in a sense a concept album, the way the songs segue together, and it's an overreach. It's like Van Dyke Parks or something like that. He didn't need to make a record as complicated as Tiny Tim's second album, and yet he did. There's so much love and work in it.
Yeah, it's interesting that I feel like the result is maybe somewhere between Van Dyke Parks, Sgt. Pepper's, and like Wildman Fisher.
Yeah, I was going to bring up Wildman Fisher. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
As we mentioned, he had, you know, this great appreciation for turn of the century pop music, but really he was something of like a professional music archivist aside from the performing talent. He claimed to have memorized and be able to perform at will thousands of songs.
Yeah.
One of his lifelong hobbies was going to the New York Public Library and looking up old sheet music and, you know, wax cylinders and 78s and just memorizing these forgotten songs. But then at the same time, also learning and memorizing current day pop songs. He talked a lot about how he loved pop music of any genre and was just truly interested in music regardless of who was making it or what genre or decade or any of that.
Right. He did People Are Strange, you know, which was at the time, the Doors were the thing, you know, they were huge.
Yeah, exactly. And on top of that, he was kind of one of the first androgynous pop stars before that was a much more common thing just a few years later.
Yeah, he was. He had that long hair in the mid-60s, and as you probably know, he wore makeup as well. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. But, you know, it's more in the sort of Liberace direction, in that, you know, You got to have a thing. You got to have a gimmick, or people aren't going to notice you.
Yeah, exactly.
He was greatly impoverished trying to make it as a musician, and he tried different. And this was a thing back then. I mean, I think even David Soul had a masked man singer thing before he ever became, Starsky and Hutch. It was a thing to make you. It was kind of a thing a manager might say to you, kid. You gotta have a thing. Go out and get a cape and a stick and a crown or something like that.
Yeah, I've seen Tiny Tim address that in interviews where his goal with the falsetto voice and the goofy clothes and the makeup was partly just to set himself apart. I mean, it was genuine choices and things that he enjoyed, also things that were influenced by older performers, specifically the move to grow out his hair and where the makeup was initially inspired by the early film star Rudolph Valentino.
Yes, exactly.
But one of the things he talked about in interviews was that he was less concerned with whether people liked what he did, more so with whether they remembered him or not, and whether he stood out and wanted to be instantly recognizable for his own music.
Yeah, I mean, seeing him in these clips you see on YouTube with the hosts of the TV shows just sort of rolling their eyes. I mean, that guy had balls to do that. I mean, I would just melt.
Yeah.
when you're on a TV show and people are basically laughing at you. He had so much, and he's so naked as well. I mean, he just had that tiny ukulele, and he's such a giant man. I mean, yeah, no one's ever going to forget him.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and he seems to just bask in the reaction, whether it's laughter or applause. He seems to just be happy to be doing what he's doing when he's up there.
Right.
Absolutely. Well, should we get into another song here?
Yeah.
All right. The next track is Christopher Brady's Old Lady, Side A, Track 8.
And now the makers of Mother Croker's Hemorrhoid Ointment present another serial in the adventures of life. The question, can an old man in his twilight years find romance in a youth that he still dreams of?
She held out her hand and he had to comply. She spoke with her eyes and Christopher Brady had met his own lady. But no one brought around. Everyone gathered, all those who mattered, to see who had caught the millionaire. When off came his top hat and down came his hair. Yeah, then he held out his hand. The old man of plenty, his young bride of 20, went on to...
That's definitely one of my favorite tracks
Absolutely.
on the record. I think, we touched on the complexity and beauty of the production and the earnestness that he presented these songs, and also the knowledge of old time music. And I think that song is a perfect example of that whole facet of his artistry.
Absolutely. And for me as a singer, the way that he slips from the falsetto into his tenor, it's just wonderful, effortless, playing two characters. And it's a narrative as well. They're not the characters aren't singing the song. It's a narrator, but whenever he sings about the female, he goes up to the falsetto, and vice versa. And I think that this is definitely my favorite Tiny Tim song of all time. I think it's just wonderful. The drama at the end when he enunciates the bullet, he goes, oh, I gave away the ending. Sorry, folks. That doesn't end well. What a beautiful song. What a wonderful melody as well.
Yeah.
But it also, sorry, I meant to say, it also touches upon something about Tiny Tim with an old man and a younger girl, which is like one of his things. He liked younger women, and that's interesting to me that song reflects that idea.
Mm-hmm. We can get into more of that a little bit later.
Right.
I'm going to run through a quick bio, and I also wanted to touch on the producer, Richard Perry, and the two other arrangers that worked on this record. So for anyone unfamiliar, Richard Perry is also one of the co-producers of Captain Beefheart's Safe as Milk record, and he also worked with countless other musicians, two notable ones that I think kind of have some similarities sonically, at least, to this, is Ella Fitzgerald and Harry Nilsson.
Right.
So he's good at making weirdos accessible.
Yeah, basically. And then two of the other arrangers on here, Gene Page, who arranged the first song we heard, My Dreams Are Getting Better All the Time, another very prolific soul musician and arranger. He did the soundtrack to the film Blackula, and he also worked with artists such as Solomon Burke, Tina Turner, and the psych band Fever Tree.
Wow.
And then the other arranger is Perry Botkin Jr., who, again, worked with many, many people, but the three I wrote down are Melanie, Jose Feliciano, and Bobby Gentry.
Oh, Bobby Gentry. Just an aside here, this album, Tiny Tim's second album, reminds me of her second album, which I can't remember the name of it, but it was very much a concept album, in a sense. I don't know if you've done a Bobby Gentry show.
We haven't. Bobby Gentry's records are just getting more and more expensive all the time, it seems like, but...
Thank you, Cocaine and Rhinestones, for that.
Oh, yeah, right, yeah.
Perry Botkin had produced and arranged Bobby Gentry's third record, Local Gentry, which also came out in 1968.
Okay.
Yep.
Just as well, the Christopher Brady's Old Lady, that one had been arranged by Botkin, and it was written by the songwriting team Anders and Poncia, which I've had this Anders and Poncia album in my collection that was given to me for years, and I just tripped when I saw their name pop up. I was like, oh, hey, look, there they are. I don't know anything about them, so that's all I have to contribute with that detail.
All right, real quick, here's some Tiny Tim bio. So Tiny Tim was born under the name Herbert Boutros Corey on April 12th, 1932. He had an early interest in playing music and also listening to his parents' 78 collection. He began as a street performer in the 40s, and he did free open mics and busking and street performer stuff at night, and then worked various messenger jobs by day to get by. And as I said, he was inspired in the early 50s by Rudolph Valentino to grow out his hair and start wearing makeup. And in 1959, he was billed as Larry Love the Singing Canary at Hubert's Museum and Live Flea Circus in Times Square, where he was doing early versions of the Tiny Tim act, basically in 1959, all the way back then. And he didn't start doing regular paid gigs until 1963, still operating under various pseudonyms. And then in 1965, he officially adopted the nickname Tiny Tim, and that was because he was, at that point, booked to follow an act starring people with dwarfism, and because Tiny Tim was actually 6'1", a very large figure at that point, it was basically just a simple ironic billing, but stuck for the rest of his career. During the mid-60s, he's performing more regularly in the Greenwich Village scene especially, and gaining a pretty strong local following amongst, the eccentrics of New York at the time. And in 1968, he was basically discovered and brought out to the West Coast to try out for Frank Sinatra's Reprise Records. He also had a starring role in a weird little movie in 1968 called You Are What You Eat, which I have not seen. I don't know if Peter or Chris, if you guys have seen it.
No.
Mm-mm.
I've come across the soundtrack before, but I've not actually tracked down the film. But I know that that was some people's first association with him was that film, actually. If you were around in the late 60s and really into avant-garde cinema.
Yeah.
So his first album, God Bless Tiny Tim, came out in 1968 and was a surprise top 10 hit, especially because of the song Tiptoe Through the Tulips. And this album was released just a few months later, trying to capitalize on the success, which it did not do. And then he made another record in 1969, a children's record actually, called For All My Little Friends.
And these are all on Reprise. They're not on like Bizarre or Straight, those subsidiaries.
No, they were on Reprise.
Yep, they're on Reprise. Yep.
Wow.
But yeah, the same time that, the Bizarre imprint is getting signed to Reprise, so you got Wildman Fisher and Mothers of Invention cutting records and basically label mates with Tiny Tim at that point. Captain Beefheart and all of that.
The GTOs.
Yeah.
The Fugs, were they not on? I think they were.
ESP disc.
But afterwards, didn't they sign to Reprise?
Oh, did they eventually?
I don't know. It seemed to me that they did after a couple of records signed to Reprise, but yeah, they did. They signed to Reprise for like Tenderness Junction.
Wow.
Yeah, Tenderness Junction, It Crawled Into My Hand, The Belle of Avenue A, and Golden Filth were all on Reprise.
Man, they were getting some weird stuff on Frank Sinatra's label.
The Fugs and Dean Martin. Wow.
Yeah, I know, right? I was looking through some of the early Reprise catalog, just trying to figure out, when did they transition into weird stuff? Because, for the first 5 years or so of that label's existence, it's basically Frank Sinatra, Dean Martin, and Trini Lopez. And then, they signed the Kinks in 65 and just start to slowly go downhill from there, it seems.
Yeah, I know. And they had Joni Mitchell and
Neil Young.
And Hendrix.
Yeah, it got to be a very interesting label very quick.
It did.
So after his third record in 69, he didn't actually put out another album until 1981. But one of the other really, monumental parts of his career was in 1969 when he married his first wife on The Johnny Carson Show, when his first wife, Miss Vicky, was only 17 years old.
Yes.
And that was, at the time, the second most viewed television episode behind the moon landing.
It was Tiny Tim's wedding.
Yep, on the Johnny Carson Show. Something like 50 million people watched it happen.
Wow.
Yeah.
Yes. So high profile.
Yeah, and then just a few short years later, he was divorced and living with his parents again.
Wow.
That's the general early bio, and I wanted to kind of get into just some of the more complicated aspects of Tiny Tim. This was something that I tried to research a lot, and it just seemed to keep going with all these different angles you could try and understand Tiny Tim from. Kind of at a loss of where to even start with it at this point.
Well, sort of circling back to what you were talking about in his early career, it's worth pointing out that before he got signed, he hung out with, Karen Dalton kind of looked after him. And Karen Dalton kind of looked after him and Dylan. He knew Dylan back then, when they were both starving. She would make sure that they kind of had enough to eat and things like that. There was this camaraderie, which I think is really interesting. And he was beloved because he could play any song you wanted.
Yeah.
By people like Bob Dylan and stuff. And then he ended up going up to Big Pink. Tiny Tim did, around the time they were making the music that would eventually end up on the Basement Tapes.
Wow.
And he's featured on bootlegs, on Basement Tape bootlegs for sure.
Oh, that's cool. I have not heard that yet. I'll have to look for that.
Yeah,
I can imagine he was like a living, breathing music archive for the folk people. That must have been just the best.
Yeah, it'd be like an iPod that you could sort of talk to.
Yeah.
Yeah. I know Bob Dylan actually had plans to make a film starring Tiny Tim. There was I don't know how much of it ever got actually shot, but there was this plan to make this like circus-themed film with Tiny Tim as the kind of ringleader of it, and it never fully got off the ground.
I'm always amazed with Karen Dalton. Just she's someone that I feel like has only come to prominence in more recent years, but here she was obviously in with the Greenwich scene, and she was at one point roommates with Cheech Marin, like another one of those wild story there.
Well, I mean, I really think that that crowd lived out of each other's pockets because they didn't have anyone else. Mm-hmm. Nobody wanted these shaggy beatniks, and I think New York was probably the best place for them, especially with the amount of amazing jazz that was going on in lofts in those days. But it was cheap to live there, and they had each other.
Yeah,
definitely. So a little more bio on Tiny Tim. He had a very strained relationship with his parents, which is also interesting because they're on the cover of this album.
I know.
Jeremy and I just watched the new documentary that came out about him, and the one thing they talked about in there is that apparently growing up, his parents had no door on their bedroom, and him just like having to walk past seeing them having sex was a really normal part or a regular part of his growing up, which had a very strange effect on him.
Oh, man.
And that was partly the whole thing of, the 78 record collection was kind of his sanctuary. He would put on the headphones and he could disappear into his own world and feel like he was a part of what was going on in these records, and he could kind of shut out the negative aspects of his life growing up with his family, who also apparently were profoundly unsupportive of his music. Even when he was famous and afterwards telling him that, he had no talent, he couldn't do this stuff, he shouldn't be doing this stuff. His mom wanted to take him to a psychiatrist once he grew his hair out and started wearing makeup, thinking that there was something deeply wrong with him. And then there's the aspect of him where he was a big germaphobe and most likely had some form of OCD. He had said that he would take something like 4 to 6 showers a day. He wore adult diapers every day because he thought that underwear was too unsanitary.
Yeah.
That's like what Howie Mandel has.
Yeah. And then there's the whole issue of Tiny Tim's sexuality and where he stood on that. He has talked about having somewhat homosexual relationships with men at points, but then has also said some like very homophobic things at times and seemed to have a very complicated relationship with that. And there's also been a lot of reports from his 3 wives that he was rarely with them and seemed to be not interested in them, and that he would dress up in women's clothing, things like that. It just seemed like something that he was never really allowed to explore publicly or really, get into. Because the other thing is he had this profound religious guilt that went along with everything. I mean, every interview you will ever see with Tiny Tim, he's bringing up Jesus as much as he possibly can. And he had a very complicated relationship with that. He had people that were trying to help him or find people that could help him. And he would just say, like, Jesus is the only psychiatrist I need, or the only doctor I need, things like that.
Right.
And would talk about how he loved going to strip clubs, but because Jesus Christ had blessed him, he could do it without having impure thoughts. And just
God bless Tiny Tim.
God bless Tiny Tim and all of his very complicated cognitive dissonance and his, kind of severe arrested development from his strange family life growing up. There's just so many things to get into with that. And it's kind of tragic in a lot of ways, but it also is interesting that he still did his best to overcome that and create this world, this safe space in his music, this kind of fantasy land to exist in.
Yeah, for sure. I heard that he was really a very lonely figure as well. And if you think about it, a lot of, after the second album, and there was these, years where he wasn't really doing records. And, if he did play gigs, it would just be him. It was a pretty lonely furrow that he'd plowed. I don't know if you've seen it, but there was, I think to me, what told me a lot about him as a character was the footage from the Johnny Carson show from 1979. Have you seen it?
I think I might have seen some parts of it. I've watched a few Johnny Carson interviews, and they had a lot of clips from various ones on the documentary. But
okay, so there's a time he went on and he did "Do You Think I'm Sexy?" and it's really disturbing. It's comical, but then you stop laughing and it's like watching a car crash. He is incredibly disturbed at the beginning of it. He's touching his face. He's nervous, but you also think, is he putting it on? He gets the song wrong, and eventually he just stops doing it and starts taking off his clothes. It's really very, very strange and very, very telling of what he is as a performer, or what he had become as a performer, where he went.
yeah, I think they did play a brief clip of that on the documentary, and it showed some of Carson's reactions, who seemed to be a little bit disturbed, but maybe concerned too, because Carson was a big supporter of him. He was on
I know.
Carson's show something like 20 times throughout his career. And it was Carson's idea to broadcast the wedding on the show. He invited Tiny Tim to do that. So he was a fan in a lot of ways, and I'm sure was concerned seeing him fall into whatever was going on.
Yeah. Anyway, that it's one of these things that I'm surprised I hadn't heard of it before, because it was such a sort of punk rock gesture in a sense.
Yeah, definitely. And he made some kind of punk related songs later in his career as well, and talked about how he thought that, the heavy metal music that was coming out was really great in the 70s
Right.
and 80s and things like that.
Right.
And he got involved with David Tibet, Current 93, and stuff along those lines towards the end of his career.
I know. I'm actually it's funny because I'm friends with David, and I wrote to him this morning and told him I was doing this, and did he have anything to say? And he said, I've got really nothing to say, or actually, I've got way too much to say, so no.
Yeah.
Yeah, that is, the more research I did, the more I was just like, I don't even know how to like fully unpack this or like present it in a way. Like there's just so much you could keep going on him. But yeah, I mean, he's a beautiful and tragic figure, and inspiring, and controversial, and I'm sure he probably hurt some people. At least he seemed to have been kind of emotionally abusive to some of the women he was with. There's just so many facets to who Tiny Tim was.
Yeah, he's how I found out about Tiny Tim was actually from Genesis P-Orridge from Throbbing Gristle.
Oh yeah, that makes sense.
As an aside here, he told me about him, and that was in 1978. I was friends with Genesis, and I asked him what he liked to listen to, and he said, "Oh, you should listen to Tiny Tim." And I was on the phone. I said, "Who?" And he said, "Tiny Tim." And I was like, "Who's that?" And that's when I found Tiny Tim's second album, and I was like, "Oh!" And to hear that coming from someone like Throbbing Gristle, like I expected him to say, "Oh, you should go out and listen to like a hairdryer." And he pointed to this beautiful record. That was what he thought I should be listening to, and indeed it was. It resonated with people, his divine weirdness.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and like I said before, I think that's the biggest reason why Tiny Tim remains a somewhat household name, and in a lot of ways kind of a hero for the more outcast side of the music industry.
Yeah, I wish I'd got to see him play.
Mm-hmm.
I probably could have. For a while there, he was playing with the band Brave Combo, and I know for sure that they played in Chicago, maybe in the early 90s or late 80s.
Yeah, I believe his final studio record that was released while he was alive is with the band Brave Combo, and that's also on Spotify for people listening. And it's really good. It's interesting hearing him right at the end of his life still have some magic in him with those songs, especially backed up by a good band.
Yeah.
Well, should we listen to another track from this album?
That's exactly what I was thinking. The next one up is She's Just Laughing at Me, side A, track 6, and this is one of the Gene Page arrangements.
She's so pretty, I wonder why. She smiles as she passes by. Could it be she's just laughing at me? I'm a loser, a clumsy clown. So why does she come around acting sweet? She's probably laughing at me. Girls never gave me half a chance. I never got a second glance. So why does she keep smiling? Could it be that I have the right to think that she really likes what she sees? Or is she just laughing at me?
One thing I found interesting about the second album that kind of added a layer of complexity to it is in the first album, I did not notice it as much, but it seems like in this album, he's reacting to the fact that a lot of people are laughing at him and not with him. And that really comes out in that last song.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, the parallel was not lost on me that was probably the case there.
I wonder, when that song resonated with me so much as a 14-year-old because I wasn't dating anyone and I really wanted to. And, I wonder if they're laughing at me, if they were nice to me. But I wonder how much it had to do with the fact that it was a realization for him, but also because he got famous, certain doors opened up for him. Like women started looking at him. I don't know what his dating life was like before he, when he was an unknown. Whether it seems like he was probably really awkward and shy around girls, but I just don't know.
Yeah, that's the impression I got. He talked about how part of the inspiration for the change in appearance with the hair and makeup was wanting to appear more effeminate and supposedly to want to, attract more women because that was something he was not doing up until that point. And he did seem to have like a lot of different relationships with women and probably with a lot of men that were not mentioned as well.
Right.
And he talked a lot about how he just admired women's beauty and nothing more than that because it would be a sin to kiss or touch them. And there's a lot of history of him having very inappropriate but verbal only relationships with underage women. The documentary touched on that too, that there's a lot of times where he's having like very explicit conversations with 13-year-olds over the phone.
Underage girls.
Yeah, exactly. So, but then there was the whole thing of how he always talked about how he viewed himself as a teenager in his head. He refused to tell people his age for the longest time in interviews because he wanted to stay a teenager and not like remind himself that he was aging.
It's quite Michael Jackson-ish.
Yeah, there's definitely some parallels to that in a lot of ways.
Yeah.
Immensely talented, but lots of Arrested Development and, not very strong role models growing up. And that,
Yeah, the living with his parents thing reminded me of Daniel Johnston.
Oh yeah,
mhm,
right.
mhm. The one thing I kind of picked up on too is that he seemed to have an attitude with women that they were more of like a status symbol or a trophy than wanting to have an actual relationship with them. Yeah, he even talked about how before his first marriage, he used to do a thing where he would make a literal trophy and give it to whoever he thought was the prettiest girl that he had met that year.
And he also had a very incredibly traditional view of what a woman's role should be. I mean, he was very staunchly and literal about the Bible he read.
Mm-hmm. Yep. There was a lot going on there.
And I think that this caused consternation because Miss Vicky was, a very smart lady.
Mm-hmm.
Although she was young, she was 17 when they married, but she had an opinion. And they also had a child together.
Yep.
And that must have really thrown a rock into his... I mean, he built his own little palace. Really. And I mean, I think it started in that room with those 78s listening to them. He built his own palace. And I get that as well, being a musician myself. We do tend to build our little rock and roll palaces in our heads. But some of us can't come out of them. I have to. But I like to escape back to it every so often,
Mm-hmm. Yeah, he seemed to be fully invested in staying in that dream world that he had created for himself.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, I think the more you think of his music from that angle, listening to these records, especially this one, you're getting, not only a glimpse into the time period it was created and like the turn of the century that inspired it, but also it's a real trip inside Tiny Tim's head.
Yes.
And you get a glimpse of his own little fantasy world, which is a fascinating experience.
I like the aspect of him talking to the audience throughout. It's a very show business record in that regard.
Yeah, definitely. And also like a little trippy that he's, playing multiple different characters and interviewing himself on the record and things like that. Yeah.
Yeah.
So I had a couple final little thoughts, anecdotes or whatever here. I have a little theory on why he was able to get so popular for the, 2 years that he was in the spotlight and making money. I think that part of it is he kind of had this like perfect Venn diagram of who might have been interested in Tiny Tim and for different reasons. So I think there was kind of like the weirdo outsider hippies that recognized that element in him. And then there was like, more like normies who are just gawking at him and are just like, oh, he's a weirdo and a high-pitched voice and isn't that silly? And then they lost interest quickly. But then as we also mentioned, I think part of the reason why Johnny Carson had him on so often is because Johnny knew all of the songs that he was covering. And there was still an older generation that had all of these old like ragtime songs and Tin Pan Alley knowledge that recognized them to be covers and were interested in it from that angle.
That's my shit.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think, you're right. I'd never thought about that, but that generation were probably really freaking out because there was a sort of scorched earth policy that, people like Hendrix brought along with them and, the long hairs or whatever. And to have someone younger who was not Sinatra singing traditional songs must have been of some comfort. Perhaps.
Yeah,
it's funny. The other day, though, somebody I saw somewhere where they were comparing Tiny Tim and his TV appearances to the Joker.
Oh,
and
that's interesting.
Having him on the show just because he is such a freak. That kind of thing that happened in the movie. That was interesting. Even the makeup is kind of similar in a sense.
Yeah, absolutely. And that was one thing. There's so many interviews you can find clips from, and unfortunately, the vast majority of them really seem like they're just kind of poking fun at him, especially all of his appearances on Howard Stern in the 80s, and things like that. But then, when he's able to be interviewed by someone that really understands and appreciates him, like there's a brief Terry Gross interview that he did later in his life where she kind of prefaced it talking about that she had always thought he was a novelty act until she learned about the music archivist angle and gained a whole new set of respect for him after that. So, yeah, it's interesting just seeing the range of how people have interpreted him or how they reacted to it.
Well, Sean, I am at a loss to comprehend what you could have put together for a Spotify recommended playlist for this episode. It's such a unique figure.
Yeah, I had a lot of fun making the playlist for this one. There's a mix of stuff from the same time period that's also kind of, outsider music. I put a handful of those turn of the century songs that he was influenced by, as well as some artists that were maybe influenced by him later on. One of the first guys that came to mind as far as the Tin Pan Alley connection is the artist Leon Redbone. Kind of both had a playfulness to their presentation and their own like world inside their head and kind of a mystique about it.
Yeah.
So I got some Leon Redbone on there, some older artists like Henry Burr. I put a Baby D track on there.
Nice.
I think there's a lot of musical similarities as well as other things. There's a Daniel Johnston track on there, Raymond Scott, John Fahey, another brilliant but troubled musician, Buzzy Linhart, who we've covered on the show before, Frank Zappa, the Mothers of Invention, his label mate, Sparks, I think is a group that had some influence, Bonzo Dog Doodah Band.
Yeah. Yeah, another group doing the throwback stuff.
I put a version of the song Beautiful Ohio by Tony Martin on there, which Tiny had stated was one of the first songs that he ever really loved. He had the version done by Henry Burr, I believe, and that was like his first favorite 78 that he would just play over and over and over again. Some other artists on there, I put a Wildman Fisher track.
Good.
Mrs. Miller, another artist that people were laughing at unfairly, who I'd like to cover on the show at some point too. Harry Nilsson, who we mentioned, the Ink Spots, David Bromberg, the Mills Brothers, and a Rudolph Valentino track.
Excellent.
So you can find that all on Spotify. Just search I'd Buy That Podcast, all one word, to find this playlist and all other season 2 playlists.
Fantastic.
Be sure to check out our Patreon if you're interested in supporting the show and getting bonus content in return. Patreon.com/I'd Buy That Podcast.
That's right. Last little story here. I watched a brief interview with Weird Al, who does some narration on the Tiny Tim documentary, and he told a quick story about going to see Ringo Starr in concert earlier on in his career. And between songs, Ringo had spotlighted Weird Al and was like, "Ladies and gentlemen, we have a celebrity in the audience." And Weird Al was just so flattered that he was about to get a real shout out from Ringo Starr. And then Ringo points at him and says, "It's Tiny Tim." Just like legit confused him, because the Beatles were fans of Tiny Tim previous to that. So they had met before, and then, we had mentioned that Tiny has had some film experience at different times. He was also in a B-level horror film called Blood Harvest in 1987, where he plays a killer clown. And I also put a track from that on the soundtrack.
Awesome.
On the theme song that he wrote for it has this line in it where he says, "I want to make the whole world laugh, even if the laugh's on me." Just kind of just in a lot of ways just sums the whole thing up. But, strange killer clown who's just willing to do whatever regardless of the reaction.
I hope that casting director went on to make a ton of money. They clearly knew what they were doing.
Yeah. So, Chris, let's turn the spotlight to you. Do you have any projects or any plugs you'd like to drop right now?
I do. I have a new album coming out in June of 21, in a few months' time. And it's a labor of love. I recorded it last year and wrote it last year. It's called The Birthday Poems. And it's, it's a double album that I made with another singer called Monica Queen. Monica is a Scottish singer. She's best known for, she sang on the first Belle and Sebastian single. But I wrote an album based on the relationship between the Scottish poet George Mackay Brown and his girlfriend / muse, Stella Cartwright. They had a very interesting relationship, and she had a very interesting relationship with many of her contemporary Scottish poets of that time. This is the 1950s and 60s. But it's a very unheard story. So I did as much research as I could, and I made an album of it. And it's coming out on Janana Records in June of this year.
Wonderful.
And how do people get it or find it?
You know, it's going to be, well, it'll be on Spotify, and it'll be away, on digital platforms. Janana Records, JNANA is the label, and chrisconley.com and my Bandcamp page, the Chris Conley Bandcamp page, it will be available from all these places.
Cool. Well, we will keep a lookout for that in just a couple months here.
Thank you.
Are you interested in mentioning the place you manage?
Oh, I don't manage it anymore.
Oh, you don't?
No, Reckless Records. I've not been there for about 6 years, actually.
Okay.
What I do manage now is a classroom.
Ah.
I'm a
Whoa.
teacher.
What do you teach?
I'm a preschool teacher.
Far out.
I'm in early childhood education. Talking of Tiny Tim. That's what I do. That said, I am still a crate digger. And lockdown was very hard for me because I would have dreams about going through record bins.
Same.
And
Absolutely.
finding weird records that don't exist by people I love and waking up sad. But I've started going back to record shops again, and I'm so happy.
Nice. I have a friend who used to have a reoccurring nightmare that he would show up at this, unnamed thrift store that just had every rare record he's ever looked for, and he would pull it out to check the condition, and then the grooves would just fall off the record.
I've had the same dream.
Whoa.
Wow.
I have, where it just sort of melts in my hand and
Yeah.
turns into sort of ash. Yeah, yeah.
All right. Well, all of us record nerds are on the same wavelength, apparently.
Yeah, yeah. Always will be.
Well, does anyone have any final thoughts about Tiny Tim before we sign off and play the final track?
I want to throw this sort of epiphany I had, because I'm guessing some of our listeners had never heard this and maybe are hearing it and not sure how to feel about it. But I had this realization at some point listening to it that in this time, the time gap, I mean, it's similar to like modern garage rock bands, like say the Black Lips or King Khan, where they're playing music similar to stuff from, that's like 60 years ago now. But they're doing it earnestly and lovingly and bringing something new to it as well. And I invite you to look at what Tiny Tim is doing through that lens.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Sean didn't mention an artist that I suggested for the playlist, which was Maddie Pryor from the band Steel Eye Span.
Steel Eye Span, yeah.
Yeah, and that's another musician and group who were doing anachronistic music stuff, well before their time, and bringing new things to it as well. Like Steel Eye Span, it's mixing, this English folk with prog.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's true. Also, you nostalgically speaking, the last 3 or 4 Bob Dylan albums were all covers of old-timey songs, weren't they?
Yeah.
I mean, he did a triple album of just sort of songs from the 30s and 40s, I think.
Mhm.
Yeah, that kind of Great American Songbook style.
Yeah, yeah.
Yep, definitely. And the other thing is, if you go through this Spotify playlist and hear some of the older tracks that he's covering and artists he was influenced by, the vocal style is actually very similar to a lot of the things Tiny Tim was doing. The falsetto and the very grand gestures and things that he's doing were much more common then. And a lot of that was simply because of where these early artists were performing and how they were recording. And if you didn't have a strong, high-pitched singing voice, a lot of times you just couldn't cut through the mix.
Couldn't cut through the mix, that's right. Yeah. It's a very good point. How wonderful. Get rid of PAs.
That's right. Well, Chris, any final thoughts before we play this last track?
No, I've been in love with this album for about 40 years, and it's I hear something new every time. I think it's just a wonderful, wonderful, beautiful piece of American art.
Agreed. All right, last track. It's All Right Now, side B, track 4, and this is a Perry Botkin Jr. arrangement.
And I noticed it was written by Hoyt Axton, the song.
True. Yes.
The country legend who I first remember being the father in the movie The Black Stallion when I was a kid.
Very random, quick last thought. I think there's also a lot of parallels between Tiny Tim and Andy Kaufman.
Yeah, very much so.
All right, I will leave everybody thinking on that while we play this last track. It's All Right Now off Tiny Tim's second album. Thanks for listening. I am Sean Hartman.
I'm Jeremy Ruggles.
I'm Peter Cook.
I'm Chris Connolly.
Dark is the sound that my memory makes. Lonely the image my yesterdays take. Down the direction in which I'm going, but when I feel I must fall, I seem to hear a voice call. It's all right now, take it easy, don't you worry. It's all right now, here is the place that I most like to be. High above life's mundanity, sunshine and laughter